Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera. Anda sedang menyaksikan Niaga AWANI bersama saya Rozman. Kami akan bawakan pelbagai rangkuman berita niaga ekonomi dari tempatan hinggalah ke antarabangsa. Sebentar saja lagi kita akan bersama rakan setugas Harits, Asyraf dan Nabilah Khaleeda yang akan bawakan perkembangan mengenai Khazanah Mega Transform 2024 untuk hari kedua selepas ini. Dan saya akan mulakan dengan laporan ini terlebih dahulu, iaitu Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim menyatakan keyakinan terhadap Belanjawan 2025 selepas menandatangani dokumen rasmi Belanjawan itu di Kementerian Kewangan pada Isnin. Belanjawan 2025 dijadualkan dibentangkan pada 18 Oktober depan di Parlimen. Menerusi perkongsian di media sosial, Anwar berkata pada pembentangan belanjawan tersebut lebih banyak pembaikan kepada struktur ekonomi akan diperkenalkan untuk memastikan pertumbuhan ekonomi yang lebih pesat itu dapat dikongsi dengan rakyat terbanyak secara saksama. Perdana Menteri pada masa sama menyatakan penghargaan kepada semua tenaga kerja yang telah bertungkus lumus untuk merangka belanjawan berkenaan. Dalam temu bual dengan CNBC baru-baru ini, Anwar juga Menteri Kewangan berkata kerajaan madani akan memberi tumpuan kepada isu inflasi dan kenaikan gaji dalam belanjawan yang akan datang. Usaha kerajaan dalam mengubah status pendapatan rakyat di negara ini telah membuahkan hasil. Salah satu kejayaan yang tercipta adalah menerusi program Sejati Madani, inisiatif yang diperkenalkan dalam Belanjawan 2024. Ikuti kisah peternakan ikan keli sangkar yang dilaksanakan di Dewan Undangan Negeri Dun Kota Lama, Kelantan yang telah berjaya membina rantaian ekonomi penduduk kampung dusun.
Komuniti ini memulakan projek penternakan ikan keli sangkar pada awal Ogos lepas. Melalui program berkenaan, penduduk yang mencari pendapatan memperoleh kemahiran menternak ikan keli selain pendapatan tambahan. 16 peserta terdiri daripada ahli jawatankuasa Pembangunan Keselamatan Kampung Persekutuan meraih pelbagai ilmu dalam menjayakan projek ini.
Jadi alhamdulillah. Jadi setakat kita buat ni, kita boleh membantu dari segi peserta-peserta, mungkin kita pemuda-pemuda untuk menambah pendapatan. Jadi di kalangan-kalangan pemuda kita yang kita berserta dengan kita ni yang tak ada kerja tetap, yang tak bekerja tetap ataupun dia kerja sendiri, yang baru habis sekolah. Jadi kita bersama dalam komuniti kita ni untuk membantu dari segi pemeliharaan ikan keli sangkar. Jadi setakat ni kita ada 16 orang peserta.
80,000 benih ikan keli dibela dalam sangkar, di mana kumpulan peserta terlibat membuat jadual tugasan masing-masing. Peserta mendapat sokongan dari agensi kerajaan persekutuan yang membimbing mereka teknik dan kaedah menguruskan peternakan ikan keli sangkar.
Program ini sangat bagus bagi saya, di samping menambah pendapatan dan juga memperoleh satu kemahiran yang baru. Macam saya ni tak nampak lah ikan keli ni kan, tapi bila saya menyertai program ini sangat bagus. Kemahirannya cara kita nak bagi makan ikan, nak gradekan ikan, lepas tu nak pasarkan ikan tersebut.
Jelas, ia bukan sekadar projek untuk meningkatkan hasil pendapatan dan mewujudkan peluang pekerjaan, tetapi juga ilmu berharga dalam bidang akuakultur. Projek itu sekiranya berjaya dilaksanakan pada skala lebih besar dengan pengeluaran kira-kira 100 kg ikan keli sehari, ia mampu memperoleh jualan kasar kira-kira RM65,000 sebulan dengan purata harga jualan bagi ikan keli yang matang adalah RM8.50 sekilogram. Peserta terlibat turut mempelbagaikan produk hiliran dalam meningkatkan pendapatan mereka seperti pekasam keli, keli berempah dan keli sejuk beku. Disebabkan permintaan tinggi dalam peniaga perai dan peruncit, mereka kini bercadang untuk menambah lagi benih ikan dan sangkar pada masa akan datang. Program Sejahtera Komuniti Madani atau Sejati Madani merupakan inisiatif baharu kerajaan madani yang bertujuan untuk memeriahkan aktiviti ekonomi di peringkat komuniti bagi meningkatkan pendapatan dengan pemberian sumbangan atau dana sehingga RM100,000 kepada komuniti yang layak.
Kerajaan memperuntukkan RM5.8 bilion bagi pembangunan negeri Sarawak dan RM6.6 bilion lagi untuk pembangunan negeri Sabah pada Belanjawan 2024. Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim sewaktu dalam Dewan Rakyat berkata kerajaan perpaduan sentiasa beriltizam untuk melahirkan kesepakatan yang telah dicapai oleh pemimpin terdahulu dalam Perjanjian Malaysia 1963 akan dapat direalisasikan. Dan tidak lama lagi Belanjawan 2025 akan dibentangkan pada 18 Oktober. Menjelang pembentangan Belanjawan ini, kita akan meliti bagaimana untuk memastikan peruntukan dana dan dasar yang lebih adil bagi mengurangkan ketidakseimbangan ini dan bagaimana untuk kita mempercepatkan lagi pembangunan yang inklusif dan mampan terutamanya di Sabah dan juga Sarawak. Dengan itu saya mempersilakan tetamu yang sudah bersedia dalam talian adalah Dr. Firdausi Sufian merupakan Ketua Pegawai Eksekutif Invest Sabah Berhad. Saya nak ucapkan terima kasih Dr. Sufian kerana Dr. Firdausi kerana sudi meluangkan masa bersama kami. Doktor, apabila kita bercakap mengenai Sabah dan Sarawak, mungkin masih ada yang berpandangan atau memberi tanggapan bahawa iaitu ia kurang dapat perhatian terutama di wilayah ini dan kita tahu Sabah dan Sarawak telah lama menghadapi jurang pembangunan dari segi infrastruktur, ekonomi dan sosial berbanding semenanjung Malaysia. Dan menurut laporan KRI baru-baru ini tentang isi rumah dan pasca pandemik 2019 hingga 2022 menunjukkan Sarawak melepasi kadar nasional KDNK tetapi kadar pembadaran masih ke belakang sedikit di bawah kadar nasional termasuk dengan Sabah di mana kadar KDNK dan pembadaran di kedua-duanya di bawah kadar nasional. Sudah tentu banyak usaha dan inisiatif yang sedang dilaksanakan dan akan dilakukan untuk kurangkan lagi jurang di antara negeri dan wilayah ini. Namun kita nak masuk internal dahulu. Apakah gap di setiap wilayah ini seperti gap ataupun jurang antara kita lihat mungkin doktor boleh bantu kita fahami keadaan semasa seperti cabaran akses pendidikan, kesihatan dan pembangunan luar bandar ketika ini. Dr. Firdausi mungkin boleh kongsikan apakah realitinya?
Ya, sekiranya kita lihat, Nina, kalau kita lihat pada bajet 2025 ini dengan tema yang disarankan iaitu ekonomi madani, negara makmur, rakyat sejahtera. Namun sudah tentu untuk mencapai kemakmuran dan kesejahteraan ini harus ditekankan kesemarataan pembangunan di negeri bawah persekutuan ini terutamanya Sabah dan juga Sarawak. Ya, sudah tentu dengan laporan yang dinyatakan tadi itu dan juga laporan-laporan sebelum ini pun sudah tentu telah memberi highlight lah tentang cabaran-cabaran pembangunan ekonomi, sosio dan juga pelbagai lagi aspek terutamanya di negeri Sabah dan juga Sarawak ini. Jadi untuk kita memacu ekonomi negara ini dengan keunggulan komparatif. Kedua-dua negeri ini juga mempunyai keunggulan komparatif yang tersendiri. Jadi kalau kita lihat bajet dengan cabaran-cabaran yang dinyatakan tadi itu tentang akses pendidikan, kesihatan, kita cerita tentang pengangguran dan juga poverty memang satu masalah yang besar dan bukanlah masalah yang baru. Jadi kalau kita lihat bajetnya akan dibentangkan ini kalau kita lihat sebelum ini dengan ucapan-ucapan Perdana Menteri dan juga Menteri Ekonomi itu ada dinyatakan tentang menaikkan lantai ekonomi itu memastikan ekonomi rakyat diperkasakan dengan gaji yang bermaruah dan juga menangani kos sara hidup iaitu pertama. Yang kedua adalah menaikkan ceiling iaitu penstrukturan semula agar kita dapat melonjakkan rantaian pengeluaran yang lebih kompetitif dan balik kepada rancangan Malaysia yang ke-12 itu HGHV iaitu high growth high value dan kedua-dua ini amat penting untuk menstruktur semula dan juga mengatasi sosioekonomi kedua-dua negeri ini. Nah, satu perkara yang baik dalam bajet 2025 ini dengan kekangan-kekangan dan juga masalah yang dihadapi di negeri Bawah Bayu dan juga di Sarawak ini. Pertama, sebab bajet 2025 ini akan memberi nada yang baru, nafas yang baru. Sudah tentu bajet amount itu pun akan meningkat sebab bila 2025 itu maka berakhirlah rancangan Malaysia ke-12 itu maka baru ada lebaran baru untuk rancangan Malaysia ke-13. Jadi apa-apa dasar fiskal yang diperkenalkan ini sudah tentu akan memberi bukan saja nafas baru tetapi pendekatan baru untuk mencapai rancangan Malaysia yang ke-13. Dan sudah tentu kalau kita melihat rancangan-rancangan sebelum ini pun memang dinyatakan dengan khusus tentang pembangunan Sabah dan juga Sarawak. Ya, memang betul bila kita cerita tentang kadar kemiskinan, kadar pengangguran, memang ada cabaran tertentu di Sabah ini. Namun kalau kita lihat effort ataupun pendekatan dan bagaimana kerajaan persekutuan dan juga kerajaan negeri ini berusaha untuk menangani masalah ini memang sudah jelas dari segi, kalau kita lihatlah statistik yang ada ini, contohlah Sabah sebelum ini mempunyai kadar pengangguran yang begitu tinggi, ya, dekat 8% sekarang sudah turun kepada 7.2%. Nah, kadar median gaji pun memang masa COVID-19 itu memang merundum, tapi selepas itu memang kita nampak ada peningkatan yang positif dekat 49%, dan Sarawak of course mendahului dengan 10% ya dari kadar kita lihat kadar pertumbuhan gaji itu. Nah, sekarang ini apa yang kita kena lihat ya secara makro level. Malaysia ini mempunyai pertumbuhan yang amat sihat, inflasi pun sihat, kadar pengangguran secara umum 3.3%, dan juga fiskal defisit itu harap-harap dapat diturunkan juga, sudah tentu dapat diturunkan, dan yang paling penting pelaburan untuk setengah tahun ini 160 bilion. Jadi dengan indikator-indikator yang positif ini sudah tentu Sabah dan juga Sarawak akan bertanya, what do I get from this? Right? How do I feel dengan kadar yang positif ini dengan trajektori yang begitu yang baik, ya, kalau kita lihat. Nah, jadi kalau kita lihat secara umum, ya, Sabah dan Sarawak ini saya rasa isunya terus benda yang sama, ya. Jadi pertama adalah sudah tentu kita lihat daripada segi ekosistem pembangunan negara ini, pembangunan negeri ini, terutamanya pembangunan untuk merancangkan pelaburan. Sebab kita kena ingat, untuk negara untuk maju, untuk menjadi jago ekonomi serantau, kita harus mengoptimumkan pembangunan negeri dengan keunggulan komparatif yang tertentu, terutamanya contohnya Sabah dan juga Sarawak. Kedua-dua adalah economic powerhouse dan juga penyumbang kepada KDNK dan dengan sumber yang begitu banyak. Jadi bukan sekadar perancangan daripada kerajaan persekutuan, ya, yang harus melihat pada pembangunan negeri ini seperti mana kita lihat dalam RMK 12 dan juga Plan Ekonomi Bandani dan juga NIMP, Plan Perindustrian Baru itu. Tapi pada masa yang sama juga kolaborasi antara kerajaan negeri dan kerajaan persekutuan itu amat penting, ya. Kalau kita lihat sekarang ini contoh daripada segi bajet pembangunan seperti yang dinyatakan tadi oleh Nina, itu kita mendapat yang tertinggi. Memang betul yang tertinggi. Namun kalau kita lihat dalam rancangan Malaysia ke-12 itu sepatutnya lebih banyak daripada itulah, dekat dalam perancangan itu Sabah sepatutnya dapat 10 bilion, Sarawak sepatutnya mendapat 8.2 bilion. Nah, itu bajet pembangunan. Nah, selain daripada bajet pembangunan yang kita lihat, yang kita selalu menjadi highlightnya, satu benda yang saya rasa patut diberi fokus apabila kita cerita tentang pembangunan sosioekonomi untuk mengurangkan pengangguran, mengurangkan pengangguran dan juga kemiskinan itu, kita harus juga melihat pada bagaimana ekosistem kerajaan, bagaimana ekosistem mengubah struktur ekonomi itu dapat dilakukan di kerajaan negeri ini. Right? Saya rasa itu yang kita harus utamakan. Kedua-dua negeri ini memerlukan hiliran yang pembangunan hiliran. Sebab inilah yang dinyatakan, dan selalu sebelum ini pun perbincangan tentang pembangunan ekonomi negeri ini adalah hiliran. Kerana hiliranlah yang memberi titik tolak dan pencetus kepada penstrukturan semula yang dapat menaikkan gaji rakyat itu. Sebab dengan nilai tambah, dengan proses nilai tambah, dengan proses nilai tambah itu memerlukan kemahiran separa mahir dan ke atas. Saya rasa ini yang penting yang harus ditekankan oleh kerajaan persekutuan untuk mengembangkan ekonomi kerajaan negeri.
Dr. Firdausi, banyak sebenarnya saya nak bincangkan tetapi kita tidak mempunyai banyak masa, tapi mungkin kita akan teruskan perbincangan mengenai terutama dalam pembangunan inklusif Sabah dan Sarawak, kerana kita tahu ini adalah perbincangan yang kritikal apabila menjelang setiap belanjawan yang diadakan setiap tahun. Dan apabila kita melihat dalam konteks pembangunan inklusif Sabah dan Sarawak, bukan sahaja untuk kita memastikan kesejahteraan jangka panjang wilayah-wilayah ini, tetapi juga bagaimana ia akan menyokong usaha ke arah Malaysia yang lebih adil dan juga seimbang. Saya nak ucapkan terima kasih kepada Dr. Firdausi Sofian, merupakan Ketua Pegawai Eksekutif Sabah Berhad, dan setiap perkongsian ini akan kami rangkumkan dalam astroawani.com dan di semua platform digital Astro Awani.
Dibawakan oleh penaja utama jelajah jiwa SME, Unify Business, rakan digital pilihan anda.
Mahu cuba perkara baharu, itu sahaja niat awal seorang usahawan ketika mula menggunakan ruang siaran langsung di media sosial untuk menjual ikan. Namun akhirnya saluran itu menjadi antara sumber pendapatan utama, bahkan meraih hasil lebih lumayan.
Pasangan suami isteri Muhammad Syujai Hashim, 42 tahun dan Salifah Ibrahim, 48 tahun, menjual ikan segar dan pelbagai hasil laut yang diperolehinya dari nelayan sekitar hutan melintang Perak. Muhammad Syujai Hashim atau lebih dikenali di kalangan pelanggan tetapnya sebagai Abang Omel, menjual ikan segar dengan kaedah melelong ikan-ikan pada harga mampu beli. Harga ikan segar yang dijualnya bergantung kepada jenis ikan dan biasanya 30% hingga 50% lebih murah daripada harga biasa di pasaran. Bersiaran 3 kali sehari bermula seawal jam 11 pagi sehingga jam 7 malam, membolehkan beliau menjual sekitar 1,000 hingga 1,500 kilogram ikan setiap hari.
Kalau ikutkan pada hari pertama, untuk orang yang memang belum kenal kita, memang penonton 2, 3, average bawah 10. Dan makan masa yang agak lama juga, lebih kurang 30 hari, mungkin tak sampai. Tapi disebabkan masa PKP, okey, benda ni dia cepat dapat maksudnya orang dapat tahu kita punya platform ni ataupun live ni disebabkan mereka duduk di rumah. Maksudnya sekarang mereka dapat tengok kita melalui telefon.
Semua jenis ikan yang ditempah oleh pelanggan akan dibersihkan dan disiang mengikut keperluan sebelum dibungkus dalam bekas kedap udara. Segar dari bot ke meja makan, setiap tempahan pelanggan akan sampai ke destinasinya dalam masa 24 jam setelah pembayaran dibuat. Cabaran utama perniagaannya adalah untuk mendapatkan bekalan ikan segar dan pada harga berpatutan. Namun mereka berdua ada formula sendiri.
Saya punya cabaran agak sukar sikit sebab kita nak carikan bekalan-bekalan yang memang sangat murah. Okey, yang memang kita boleh buat agak sukar. Disebabkan kita kena beli melalui nelayan-nelayan yang memang kadang-kadang kurang sumber, okey, menyebabkan apa-apa barang pun naik. Okey, jadinya sekiranya kalau saya ada pilihan untuk buat sendiri daripada A to Z, saya rasa mungkin saya lebih selesa untuk terus membantu mereka di luar sana.
Bagi unjuran tahun 2025, beliau amat berharap agar permohonan memperoleh permit bot perikanan laut dalam yang dipohonnya dari Jabatan Perikanan Malaysia diberi kelulusan segera. Dengan perolehan permit aktiviti perikanan laut dalam, syarikatnya mampu mengekalkan harga semasa yang mampu dibeli oleh pelanggan.
Dibawakan oleh penaja utama jelajah jiwa SME, Unify Business, rakan digital pilihan anda.
Assalamualaikum, salam hormat. Kami bawakan kepada anda hari kedua bagi Khazanah Mega Trans Forum 2024 langsung dari Mandarin Oriental Hotel Kuala Lumpur, dan sudah tentu banyak perkara yang akan menjadi fokus dan juga tumpuan sepanjang hari kedua ini. Dan saya nak recap sedikit apa yang dinyatakan oleh Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim semalam, terutamanya berkait dengan Mega Trans dan juga bagaimana Malaysia perlu menetapkan hala tujunya dalam menjadi pencipta teknologi dan juga membawa arus perubahan dan mendahului dalam arus perubahan itu. Jadi bersama dengan saya pada ketika ini Saudara Hafizi Razali yang merupakan penasihat dasar awam dan komunikasi strategik. Hafizi, pertama sekali kalau kita melihatkan apa yang dinyatakan oleh Perdana Menteri, ekonomi berperi kemanusiaan ataupun berteraskan rakyat, bagaimana Hafizi melihat fokus dan juga apa yang sedang dilaksanakan oleh kerajaan dan kerjasama sektor awam swasta? Adakah berada di tahap yang baik dalam nak memenuhi aspirasi yang dinyatakan oleh Perdana Menteri semalam itu?
Terima kasih Harits. Yang pertamanya kita kena fahamkan bahawa bila kita berbicara berkenaan dengan faktor ekonomi, yang paling penting berkenaan dengan tenaga buruh adalah dari segi produktiviti. Jadi kalau kita ikutkan dalam masa 5 ke 10 tahun yang kebelakangan ini, produktiviti kita tidak selari dengan peningkatan gaji itu. Jadi peningkatan gaji adalah satu elemen yang utama dalam memberi satu kemanusiaan dalam alam pekerjaan. Dan yang kedua adalah berkenaan dengan apa tindakan kita untuk memastikan pekerjaan yang kita lakukan dan upah yang diberi itu adalah selari dengan kadar inflasi yang kita lihat tidak menentu sejak kebelakangan ini. Dan apa yang perlu ditekankan kerajaan adalah untuk memastikan polisi gaji minima, gaji progresif itu sentiasa kita lihat kembali dan menambah baik dari semasa dan ke semasa, dan tidak semestinya dengan gaji minima yang kita ada sekarang ini semestinya cukup untuk tahun-tahun yang akan mendatang. Dan lebih penting lagi adalah untuk kita menekankan sosial mobiliti sosial. Jadi bila kita berbicara berkenaan dengan pekerjaan yang bermaruah, yang lebih penting adalah untuk memastikan pekerjaan yang kita lakukan itu mempunyai satu tangga untuk kita mengalami atau mempunyai kehidupan yang lebih baik mengikut jangka masa yang kita telah tetapkan. Jadi saya sambut saranan kerajaan untuk syarikat swasta dan juga dari sektor kerajaan juga untuk menambah peluang untuk pekerja upskill, menambah kemahiran mereka dan juga melihat peluang-peluang yang ada dari segi sektor high growth, high value supaya mereka juga dapat terlibat dalam kemajuan ekonomi yang kita ada dalam beberapa tahun yang akan datang.
Bercakap berkenaan dengan high growth, high value, bagaimana Hafizi melihat usaha kerajaan dalam bercakap juga soal mobiliti sosial, kerana akhirnya orang kalau nak cari kerja, kena datang Kuala Lumpur, bandar-bandar besar, Johor Bahru dan sebagainya. Walaupun duduk di Ipoh, mungkin anak muda suka nak mencari kerja kerana orang cakap, itu adalah bandar orang pencen. Satu tahap pemikiran dah jadi sebegitu. Bagaimana usaha kerajaan untuk memastikan bahawa high growth, high value itu, kesamarataan pembangunan itu berpaksikan sebagai contoh industri-industri tertentu. Sarawak fokus dengan hidrogennya, new emerging economy. Bagaimana Hafizi melihat usaha itu? Penglibatan 3 peringkat kerajaan terutamanya cukup penting, Persekutuan Negeri dan juga peringkat PBT.
Ya, dalam konteks high growth, high value, yang kita perlu fahamkan adalah ia berteraskan kepada pengetahuan, knowledge dan juga kepada inovasi. Dan kedua-dua perkara ini tidak akan kita dapat capai tanpa satu fokus kepada pembangunan modal insan. Dan ini adalah amat penting. Dan satu negara yang ingin mewujudkan teknologi sendiri. Jadi dalam konteks tersebut kita perlu lihat kepada pengalaman negara yang telah maju seperti negara yang paling berinovasi di Switzerland. Mereka menekankan bahawa sekolah itu, sistem pendidikan itu perlu disediakan untuk industri yang kita mahukan dalam masa yang jangka masa pendek, pendengahan dan juga jangka masa panjang. Dan melangkaui sistem persekolahan dan pembelajaran di universiti, perlu ada satu penekanan yang lebih kepada research and development. Dan dari perspektif ini, kerajaan kita telah meletakkan satu fokus untuk meletakkan dana kepada R&D sebanyak 3.5% KDNK dalam masa 3 ke 5 tahun yang akan datang. Dan ini adalah selari dengan apa yang telah dilakukan oleh negara-negara maju, yang mana kalau kita lihat di Switzerland 4% daripada KDNK adalah khusus hanya untuk research dan development. Dan saya ingin membawa kembali kepada konteks perbincangan di Khazanah Mega Transform ini, yang mana sudah ada satu perspektif baru bahawa syarikat-syarikat GLC, GLIC dan swasta juga perlu mengambil inisiatif untuk terlibat bersama kerajaan dalam memastikan capaian kepada R&D itu dapat kita penuhi. Contohnya saya ada berbicara bersama dengan wakil dari Petronas Ventures dan juga venture capital firms dan juga private equity firms yang sudah mula untuk berjinak jinak meletakkan capital dalam inovasi dan teknologi yang sedia ada untuk kita majukan bersama. Jadi perkara-perkara ini adalah penting dan tidak boleh hanya dilihat daripada satu sudut sahaja, tetapi perlu dilengkapi dengan beberapa inisiatif yang lebih targeted supaya sistem yang lebih convenient, kondusif itu diwujudkan ke arah mewujudkan satu high growth, high value. Seperti yang Harits cakap, kita tidak mahu kemajuan itu hanya tertumpu kepada Kuala Lumpur ataupun Johor Bahru saja, tetapi lebih meluas, melangkaui bandar-bandar yang telah mendapat limpahan daripada kemajuan teknologi dan inovasi yang mereka ada daripada ekosistem yang sedia ada.
Saya nak membawa perbincangan kita melihat satu lagi perkara yang mungkin seringkali disentuh oleh Perdana Menteri, iaitu berkait dengan mungkin sosialisme untuk golongan kaya dan juga ialah isu-isu kapitalisme dan sebagainya ini. Bagaimana Hafizi melihat usaha kerajaan dalam nak memastikan, ialah boleh saya sifatkan sebagai mengawal selia perniagaan besar terutamanya tycoon tertentu ini, dan juga bagaimana Hafizi melihat peranannya dalam ialah nak peranan kerajaan dan juga syarikat-syarikat ini supaya nak memastikan bahawa ialah mereka ini juga pembayar cukai pada masa sama, need to be fair, nak strike the balance antara kerajaan dan juga syarikat-syarikat besar yang perlu bersama dalam nak membangunkan negara ini, Hafizi.
Ya, saya faham dengan prinsip yang dibawa oleh Perdana Menteri, iaitu kita ingin lebih merakyatkan ekonomi tersebut. Dan fokus utamanya adalah untuk memastikan mekanisme yang telah diletakkan kerajaan untuk merancangkan ekonomi ataupun untuk membantu rakyat benar-benar disalurkan kepada mereka yang benar-benar memerlukan. Jadi itulah sebab kita ada perbincangan sama ada kita perlu lebih agresif dalam membantu mereka yang memerlukan dan dalam masa yang sama mengambil resources daripada mereka yang telah pun menerima yang mungkin dikatakan sebagai berpendapatan tinggi ataupun menengah atas. Jadi itu adalah satu perspektif. Dan perspektif kedua adalah dari segi struktur ekonomi yang kita ada sekarang. Yang penting sekarang adalah untuk kita memastikan sistem ekonomi yang kita ada ini adalah kompetitif. Dan malangnya di Malaysia, kita ada kekangan yang mana ada beberapa syarikat yang mempunyai monopoli yang agak kuat kepada beberapa struktur ekonomi asas di negara kita. Jadi itu yang selalu ditekankan oleh Perdana Menteri bahawa kita tidak mahu kekayaan negara itu tertumpu kepada beberapa kelompok elit, dan kelompok-kelompok elit inilah yang juga memiliki syarikat-syarikat tertentu yang beroperasi dalam sektor-sektor ekonomi yang dikawal ketat oleh syarikat yang bermonopoli di negara kita ini. Jadi dengan adanya undang-undang seperti undang-undang anti-kompetitif, saya berharap kerajaan dapat meluaskan lagi mandat kepada MyCC contohnya, dan enforcement itu juga perlu selari dengan visi yang telah diletakkan kepada Perdana Menteri untuk menyeimbangkan fokus untuk merakyatkan ekonomi dan juga untuk merancangkan ekonomi dalam masa yang sama.
Hafizi, kita tidak boleh lari dari ketidaktentuan global. Isu-isu seperti geopolitik, isu di Asia Barat, dan juga sebagai contoh kita lihat isu perubahan iklim. Ini semua antara cabaran yang perlu meletak Malaysia, bukan sahaja kerajaan tetapi whole of nation approach dalam kita nak mendepani krisis-krisis sebegini dan juga mendepani impak daripada krisis yang berlaku. Sebagai contoh apa yang berlaku di Asia Barat, sudah tentu harga minyak mentah dah mula naik dan sebagainya. Mungkin bagaimana Hafizi melihat bahawa tahap kesediaan itu perlu ditingkatkan dan perlu memastikan bahawa bukan sahaja kerajaan tetapi seluruh negara perlu bersedia dalam menghadapi ketidaktentuan global, terutama isu-isu melibatkan megatrends ini, dan kita ada megatrends untuk kita menempuh segala cabaran ini, Hafizi.
Ya, saya lihat ada satu fokus yang agak objektif dari pihak kerajaan ini dari segi visi, misi dan polisi. Tapi yang lebih penting sebenarnya adalah koordinasi di antara kerajaan, kementerian-kementerian terlibat dan juga agensi yang berkaitan supaya semuanya itu dapat diselarikan di bawah satu program yang kita dapat monitor, evaluate dan juga bertambah baik dari semasa ke semasa. Itu satu. Yang keduanya adalah berkenaan dengan implementasi. Implementasi itu adalah lebih penting daripada apa yang kita ada di atas kertas sekarang. Tetapi ini adalah permulaan yang baik. Dan dengan adanya polisi seperti NIMP, NETR, Nation of Funds daripada Khazanah dan juga Malaysia Startup Roadmap Ecosystem, saya percaya bahawa dengan adanya polisi-polisi ini kita dapat memastikan bahawa tidak ada industri yang ketinggalan daripada arus pembawakan teknologi yang telah berkembang pesat di negara barat khususnya. Tetapi yang lebih penting lagi adalah untuk kita memastikan kita terus dapat membawa perubahan tersebut dalam masa yang terdekat. Kenapa? Kalau tidak kita akan ketinggalan dengan arus pembawakan teknologi-teknologi yang spesifik ini. Contohnya dari segi automasi, kalau kita lambat untuk memastikan syarikat-syarikat kecil dan sederhana untuk automate operasi dan pekerjaan yang ada, kita akan terus bergantung kepada pekerja-pekerja asing yang kini melebihi 3 juta jumlahnya di Malaysia ini. Dan dari segi perubahan iklim, kita mempunyai kapasiti yang cukup daripada syarikat-syarikat tenaga kita. Dan yang lebih penting lagi adalah untuk menyesuaikan teknologi yang kita telah faham dan telah aplikasikan untuk disesuaikan dengan perubahan yang terbaru daripada demands daripada perubahan iklim contohnya. Dan ini akan mewujudkan katalis baru kepada kawasan-kawasan yang telah pun mempunyai ekosistem yang agak tersusun dari segi oil and gas contohnya. Jadi ada banyak peluang yang perlu kita sambut. Tapi lebih penting lagi adalah untuk kerjasama antara kerajaan dan pihak swasta itu dipercepatkan dan disusun dengan lebih kemas dari semasa ke semasa.
Dan saya juga percaya bahawa ini adalah masanya untuk JLIC, mungkin juga VC untuk mula melihat kajian-kajian teknologi yang dibangunkan di peringkat universiti yang sering orang anggap bahawa ianya berakhir di bookshelf kerana hanya prototype sahaja. Sebab apa tak proceed? Sebab tak ada dana, tak ada siapa nak tolong kami, isu pemasaran dan sebagainya. Dan saya rasa ini adalah masa untuk mula JLIC melihat kepada bagaimana kerjasama mungkin dengan KPT dan sebagainya. Akhir sekali sebelum dalam 3 minit perbincangan kita ni, Hafizi, bagaimana Hafizi melihat bahawa Malaysia akan mempengerusikan ASEAN tahun hadapan dan chairmanshipnya next month Hafizi akan ke Vientiane dan juga mungkin juga kalau kita nak melihat bahawa usaha Malaysia untuk terlibat secara aktif sebagai anggota BRICS, bagaimana kerjasama ini dan juga menunjukkan sebuah ekonomi yang terbuka, Malaysia sebuah ekonomi yang terbuka ini menunjukkan neutralnya Malaysia dan sedia bekerjasama dalam semua pihak, semua negara dalam nak membawa perubahan dan juga menunjukkan kedudukan kita yang sebenar di peringkat global ini, Hafizi.
Kepengerusian ASEAN ini adalah satu peluang yang sangat baik untuk kerajaan Malaysia membuktikan bahawa nilai-nilai yang dibawa daripada konsep madani yang dijunjung Perdana Menteri itu dapat dibawa ke peringkat antarabangsa. Dan lebih penting lagi adalah untuk kita membawa suara negara-negara yang berkecuali ini untuk mengambil satu posisi yang berlandaskan kemanusiaan. Itu lebih penting daripada mengambil side daripada mana-mana pihak. Yang pertama. Yang kedua adalah berkenaan dengan untuk kita tidak meletakkan pergantungan yang terlampau banyak kepada sesebelah pihak. Baik dari Amerika Syarikat ataupun dari China. Dan penyertaan Malaysia dalam BRICS itu adalah satu bukti bahawa kita bersedia untuk terlibat secara langsung dalam ekonomi dunia. Dan bukan sahaja kita berkawan dengan seramai mana yang boleh, tetapi juga kita mewujudkan lebih banyak hubungan antarhala dan kita memastikan bahawa kita dapat juga mempunyai akses kepada market yang pasaran yang terbuka dalam kawasan BRICS ini, iaitu 1/3 daripada KDNK dunia. Dan yang ketiganya adalah untuk kita memastikan bahawa apa yang dibawa atau dirisaukan oleh masyarakat dari ASEAN ataupun BRICS ini dapat diperjuangkan Malaysia di bawah suara Perdana Menteri yang lantang bersuara berlandaskan kemanusiaan ataupun hubungan ekonomi yang lebih adil dan juga satu posisi yang yang lebih terbuka dan juga tidak hanya bergantung kepada perdagangan dari segi penggunaan US dollars contohnya. Jadi dengan adanya perubahan idea-idea baru yang dibawa oleh Perdana Menteri ini, diharapkan bahawa negara-negara lain juga akan turut bersama Malaysia dan turut bersama dengan negara BRICS untuk membawa satu cara baru untuk berdiplomasi dan untuk memastikan hubungan dagang itu sentiasa terbuka walau pihak mana pun kita berada. Ya.
Hafizi, terima kasih Hafizi Razali yang merupakan penasihat dasar awam dan komunikasi strategik. InsyaAllah dari semasa ke semasa mungkin rakan saya Syaf Syukri akan bersama dengan Hafizi di Vientiane. Selamat ke Vientiane nanti beberapa hari nanti. Okey, baik, sekian sahaja untuk waktu ini. Selepas ini anda akan bersama dengan Nabilah Khaleeda yang akan membawa perincian lanjut terutama dari segi isu melibatkan brain drain. Apa masalah sebenarnya ni? Kita nak jadi negara maju, kita nak high growth, high value, tetapi ada kepakaran ke? Bagaimana pakar-pakar luar ini nak bawa balik ke Malaysia? Itu antara cabaran terbesar Malaysia, dan bagaimana megatrends pada ketika ini mampu menjadi platform terbaik. Selepas ini anda akan bersama dengan Nabilah Khaleeda. Kita berhenti rehat seketika.
Oktober ini, Home of Sports Astro mempermudahkan anda menerokai lebih banyak aksi sukan secara langsung. Astro Grandstand, nikmati perlawanan pilihan. Astro Premier League, segalanya tentang Premier League yang anda dambakan.
Quite incredible, as you say.
Astro Football, dunia bola sepak antarabangsa serta kelab untuk para peminat. Astro Badminton, membawakan bulu tangkis ke pangkuan anda.
This is sensational.
Astro Sports Plus, seleksi terhebat acara-acara sukan.
Oh, what a play!
Lebih banyak aksi, pelbagai saluran, lebih banyak untuk anda terokai.
It's been a really good start.
Absolutely loving that.
Unbelievable. They've been doing it all day.
Home of Sports Astro, kini lebih mudah untuk semua.
Semangat kepahlawanan terus meledakkan pertarungan di GP Perak. Setiap pasukan penuh diuji serangan padu. Yang gagah bakal bermegah, membawa gelaran dan kemenangan. Tiada detik mampu dipersiakan. Inilah perjuangan wira-wira sukan warisan. Satu dekad penuh gemilang. Emas Anwar Sepak Takraw League Premier secara langsung di Astro.
Alright, welcome back to Niaga Awani with me, Nabilah Khaleeda. Earlier we had our colleague Harits Asyraf with his guest discussing another important topic, and we're still at Mandarin Oriental, Kuala Lumpur for Khazanah Megatrends Forum, or KMF 2024, where we discuss about the trends, the global trends that will shape our future industry, but not just industry as a whole, but the whole, how we live, how we think, and how we discuss about not just technology, but also how we, the whole landscape of industry that we live in right now. So right now, for today, we want to discuss further, dive deeper on how these global megatrends are not just abstract concepts, but also a tangible forces that is impacting the broader economic landscape. So to discuss further on the specific topic about brain drain and how it impacting the emerging economies. Joining me right now today is Raja Hamza Abidin, the Board of Director Talent Corp. Thank you so much for joining me right now here at Mandarin Oriental for KMF 2024. Perhaps we could start. How would you describe the whole ecosystem of brain drain, not just in Malaysia, but the other countries in the same region?
Okay, number one, talent is a key issue for all countries in the globe right now. Whether you're talking about Taiwan, China, Malaysia, Singapore, talent is probably one of the key issues for every multinational out there. So brain drain is a problem not only for Malaysia, but for most countries in the world. What we can do as a country is to attract the right talent to come back. I think that's one. Number two is to incentivize new and industries that can pay well, the likes of semiconductors, data centers, technology. These are the sectors that are able to pay good salaries or can pay USD type salaries back in Malaysia. Number three is by investing in training programs. I think that's key. As our own talent, what we're doing down south with Johor and Singapore, we're investing a lot of cross-border training programs, cross-border internships between Singaporeans and Malaysian companies. I think that will create win-win situations for all market players to increase the wages, because I feel like brain drain is not the key issue. Actually, it's about a wage gap, about addressing that wage gap, closing the wage gap between Malaysia, Singapore and its peers, and creating more high-value, high-income opportunities for all our staff.
Raja, before we go dive deeper into this discussion of the topic brain drain, can you actually help us understand what are the driving factors to these issues? Because it's not something new, right? Not just in Malaysia, like I mentioned earlier, it's a global issue. So what could be the driving factors? Is it different from the before pandemic and also after pandemic?
Okay, I think now with the work from home and working remotely, job functions, brain drain is probably less of an issue than before because people can work from anywhere but still earn a Singapore dollar or US dollar income, right? If I look at where a lot of Malaysians are, actually the key countries are in the UK, Singapore, Indonesia, and Hong Kong to a certain extent, right? So these are all hubs for Malaysians overseas. So I think what we need to do is to engage them. I think sometimes one is they can come back to return to Malaysia. But number two is I think engaging them in terms of helping out mentorship opportunities to give them to help to, let's say, the startup ecosystem. We have success stories in the UK. For example, I have a friend who I went to university with. She started a startup and now she just raised $50 million of capital, and I'm getting her to mentor some startups over here in Malaysia. So I think if how we frame brain drain is important, right? If we think of it as just a one-way street where everyone's just leaving the country, I think it's a very unproductive discussion. But we think of them as our assets going overseas, learning and maybe coming back, or maybe contributing in a different way. I think that's a lot more exciting for the ecosystem. And again, at Khazanah Megatrust today, in terms of how we understand AI, the dynamics in China, India, I think there's a lot of dynamics where actually net Malaysia is a beneficiary, but we must do something about it versus just letting it steady state just grow by itself. So we need to take it by the horns and actually create value for us to create more high-income jobs in Malaysia.
Honestly speaking, we can actually see some initiatives that was done by our kerajaan, our government, under the Kerajaan Madani. But speaking of which, we want to look at the technological advancements right now. We have AI and we're moving towards Industry 5.0. It's not IR 4.0 anymore, it's 5.0 right now. So looking at all these advancements and also we have automations as well, do you see that this movement or rapid movement can actually impact towards the retention of talents in Malaysia?
I think it's with AI, it's actually a lot more exciting to be in Malaysia rather than before. What I see now is Malaysia, it's a good crossroads of affordable costs, but at the same time, it's a breeding ground for the China Plus One strategy. What that means, I would say I'll break down to three main hubs, right? One is Penang, with the tailwind of semiconductor companies needing to move to Southeast Asia to diversify their production base from China and Taiwan. This creates a golden opportunity for us to attract high-level manufacturing, advanced packaging. These are stuff that will never come to Malaysia before because we never forward invested in them. Now these are the kind of people who are interested in moving to Malaysia and spending time in Malaysia to grow this kind of business. So number one, if I look at Penang, super exciting. Number two, down south in Johor, speaking to some of the Singaporean peers, there's a lot of companies willing to move some of their operations over because Singapore is just becoming too expensive, right? So again, AI is where you need high-level talent, right? So again, Johor has to solve that talent gap. Where do we get engineering talent? How do we get affordable engineering talent? I invested in a company in Singapore called StackUp, right? And they plug into blockchain talent across the globe. And actually, the key sources of blockchain talent is still, let's say, in Vietnam, in the US. But actually, Malaysia has its own share of blockchain developers. How do we tap into that to actually grow the blockchain ecosystem? So this is one of the examples where we have some bright spots, but we've always focused on the difficulties. We will never get there. So again, I think where I look at myself from a talent corp point of view, we are trying to understand the gaps that AI creates in the job market. That's number one. And by understanding the gaps, we know where to retrain some of our staff. We know where to focus in terms of the Ministry of Higher Education, some of the courses, and also some of the TVET courses. And then we target so that everyone who graduates from these courses are able to attract high-level paying jobs, right? Versus just, if you have a degree and you just become an admin staff and earn 3,000 ringgit. That is not what we want. We want to create high-level jobs so that everyone can grow together.
Do you think we are at the right lane of going towards that retaining talents in the future?
I believe, I was lucky enough to be able to work in Singapore, in Hong Kong, across a variety of multinational companies. And I look at a lot of my Malaysian friends. They're all very passionate about coming back and contributing. And if you look at the world economy at the moment, China and Hong Kong is struggling. Europe is struggling. So again, there are a lot of Malaysians in these markets who are looking for opportunities back home so that they can contribute. So again, I feel like now versus before, because of global economic movements, we have ability to attract the best talent to move back. But at the same time, we got to create the pull factor. What are jobs that are created? For example, I have a friend in the UK working for Google's data center team. He wants to come back, but again, now Google is creating a data center here. There is an opportunity for him to come back, opportunity for him to move laterally within Google to actually look at the region, to look at data centers. So those are the small tidbits why I feel like, hey, there are success stories around, but we need to actually get more success stories and tell people about it, because if we don't market ourselves as an attractive destination for talent, people won't move over.
And as like what Raja said earlier, we have also interesting push factor or pull factor towards all the talents in the world. But another thing that we can look at is about being the emerging nations like Malaysia. How do we compete with other nations that's already very developed, especially when it comes to offering high-paying jobs, and that doesn't lure away the talents?
Yes. So okay, everyone talks about working in Singapore, but again, people forget that working in Singapore entails very high cost. Rental for a simple apartment is minimum like 4,000 to 5,000 Singapore dollars, so equivalent of 16,000 to 17,000 ringgit. One example, I have a founder friend, he founded a firm called Zendit. They are worth about $3 billion, Indonesian-based, but with operations in Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia. So again, he actually moved over to Malaysia. He brought his whole family. He's origin from Penang, but he moved to the US. And he actually moved the whole family back to Malaysia because he felt that Malaysia, given our cost, given our opportunities for growth, and also as a hub for travel, it's still very exciting. So again, there are ways to pull these guys over vis-a-vis our more developed countries, but we offer a different menu. We offer them a menu of livability, costs, and also growth, because again, I think it's still a great place to do business with a 30 million population. And lastly, it's a great place to list businesses as well. An IPO market is booming. We have about 3 billion ringgit of total inflows in the market. So again, I feel like there's a strong tailwind if we can market ourselves right. And I feel like what the ministry is doing, the government is doing in terms of marketing ourselves to foreign investors is going through the right way. The ringgit is moving well, the stock market is doing well. We just need to continue this tailwind. So it's not just a one-year effect, it's a multi-year effect that rolls over to the next generation.
We are doing good, guys. We are doing good for Malaysia in terms of the ringgit, like you mentioned, and then also the markets. But the future economy that we're looking at right now is about healthcare and also green economy and also fintech, financial technology. Yeah. But do you think our local upskilling and reskilling movement or initiatives are actually good enough to actually build our talents locally?
One, I would say within all those sectors that we spoke about, I think engineering talent is still key. I feel like we still need to create the right courses and programs to create right development talent or / engineering talent for tech companies. I still think that's a key skill gap that needs to be improved on. Number two, I think some of the sectors talk about the green economy. Again, the economy is still very nascent across the whole of Southeast Asia. So I see some of the sovereigns hiring heads of ESGs, Petronas as a head of ESG as well. So I think it's moving in the right way. I see what's happening in Sarawak with hydrogen, and it's super exciting. It's something that's gathering attention from foreign investors, the likes of the Japanese, the Koreans. So I feel like there's a ripe ecosystem there. But again, I think to the point of where talent comes in, again, it's always chicken and egg, right? In the past, there's never been a market for talent for green energy, for any green initiatives, but now there is. So, and the talent pays well because there's a shortage of people there, supply, demand. So again, when I look at some of my peers in Indonesia, how they've come up, how the ESG scene has come up, it's all through just, recycling of talent. People who may not be, the right skill set yet, but I think training them up and growing them in that part and giving them exposure. That's in terms of, carbon credits, in terms of, batteries, EV storage, in terms of EVs, in terms of hydrogen. So there's a lot of ways to train up people. And given that the ecosystem is still so nascent, that you don't have to be so well advanced to get the right talent to come in. So I think it's an area where I know the government speaks about the energy transition initiative. That's I think in the right way. And speaking to our investors, some of the foreign investors in Singapore and in the globe, is something that actually attracts attention to Malaysia.
So Raja, as for someone coming from Talent Corp itself, do you think that there could be more a radical policy that could be introduced to actually tackle this issue of brain drain right now? It's doing well, it's doing better, but do you think there could be a more radical policy in the future, or perhaps other policy other than radical policy?
Okay, I think one of the things that we really want to push is this internships, right? So I think we have a pool of MNCs. We talk about Infineon, Intel, all moving to Malaysia, spending billions of dollars. But again, what is the positive externality to Malaysia? So again, what we are doing is we're talking to these companies at Talent Corp. We are saying, hey, how about we fund some of these internships and you co-fund them? But in essence, we can send it to your HQ, whether it's in the US, in Japan, and then we actually, why don't you bring them back to Malaysia to help your factories and your offices here in Malaysia. So again, it's very targeted, right? We speak to corporates, we craft an initiative that's targeted to them, and then we send our talent there, and then we bring them back here. So again, you're actually helping Malaysians get exposure, and then they have a job after that, because a lot of these companies hire thousands of Malaysians here, but they want better talent. They want people who know their culture, know their ecosystem, and pay it forward, right? So again, what can the government do more? I think we need to be more aggressive in terms of some of these crop subsidies for internships, because the companies in China, in Taiwan are looking for it as well. They want the government to be involved in their talent program, because they want win-win situations on both sides. If I'm a Chinese company, if I see that the government is willing to fund some of these internships, but at the same time, I will do the offtake in 6 months or 12 months, because I'll be funding their careers or their future internships. This is something that is win-win, and it shows that the government is very much into helping increase the talent density in Malaysia. And I think this is something that's super exciting. We can send a signal to the market that Malaysia is very open to business, because Vietnam is trying to do it, Indonesia is trying to do it, but they don't have the ecosystem that we have. We have the Penang, Malaysia, KL ecosystem that is amazing for a semiconductor, but we need to double down on it.
Last one before we end this session, we have about 1 minute left. Do you think we want focusing on the professionals right now of the topic of brain drain? Do you think we can create some kind of competitive incentives, some kind of strategy that actually could retain these professionals here, not just about the young talents?
Okay, I mean, I'll be direct. I think in terms of tax, I think one of the areas where our tax is still relatively high versus Hong Kong, Singapore, and that's where a lot of our Malaysians who are aggressive, who are doing well, are based in terms of their careers, right? I think if there's a way in terms of targeting sectors that are beneficial to the government, whether it's in terms of AI, in terms of technology, in terms of healthcare, green, we can incentivize some of these folks to come back, and also maybe incentivize some of the folks who are already in the industry to get preferential tax treatment or tax credits. I think that'll be great, because again, we want to focus on high value jobs. We don't want your low level jobs. We want high value jobs, given incentives for 5-10 years to create a more affordable tax system. So in the end, people earn more, people will give back more, and more people will go to these industries because they want to earn more money as well. So again, you got to think of it, what's the self-interest of these people? Okay, one is, yes, they want to grow their career. Secondly, is money as well. If we can incentivize through preferential tax, it'll be a third tailwind for them to grow in this industry.
Thank you so much. I would like to say thank you so much to Raja Hamza Amidain, Board of Director Talent Corp, for helping us understand and for his time to discuss about the brain drain in the emerging economy here at KMF 2024. We have a lot more discussion after this with Nina Rozman and Dr. Trishayo after the break. So I'll see you next time. So we'll go to Nina Rozman after this on KMF 2024, Khazanah Megatrends 2024.
Malaysia sebenarnya berada di kedudukan kedua terburuk di dunia berkaitan keseimbangan hidup dan kerja.
LRT3 sudah akan mula beroperasi suku ketiga 2025. Kerja-kerja fizikal dan penstrukturan sudah mencecah 95%.
KPM sebenarnya sedang memperincikan cadangan untuk menyediakan allowance kos sara hidup tingkatan 6.
Libat urus antara umat Islam dan agama lain penting supaya dapat mengelakkan ataupun membawa kepada Islamofobia.
Hi, I'm Nina Rozman, and today we're going to talk about Malaysia's economic growth, as today we stand at a pivotal moments in Malaysia's journey, where the nation confronts numerous challenges, from economic reforms and social justice to climate change and even global leadership. And yesterday, Prime Minister Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim, in his welcoming speech at the Khazanah Megatrends Forum 2024, he laid out on a comprehensive vision for Malaysia's future. And his call for a humane economy for social justice and bold structural reforms comes at a time when both the local and global landscape are undergoing significant transformations. And to help us unpack the implications of this and explore Malaysia's role in the evolving geopolitical and economic climate, and I am honoured to have with me Dr. Trishayo, the Associate Professor of Practice at the School of Politics and International Relations, University of Nottingham, Malaysia. I want to say thank you very much, Dr. Trisha, for joining me. And definitely talking about Khazanah Megatrends Forum 2024, we want to take a look and identify what are the global challenges, opportunities, and this is some of the mega trends that will shape the future of Malaysia also. And firstly, I'm going to take a look on the economic reforms and social justice, where the Prime Minister also emphasised on the need for human economy for social justice, where economic reforms prioritise equitable wealth distribution. Based on your perspective, Doctor, how feasible do you think this vision in the current Malaysia's socio-political climate?
Thank you so much for having me today. Indeed, I think not just Malaysia, but the world is at this critical moment where decisions have to be made in order to shape the future of our economy, of our social political landscape, and so on. Some of the key trends that Prime Minister Dato Sri Anwar Ibrahim in his speech yesterday talked about include things like climate change, the challenge of geopolitical shifts as well. One thing he talked about, which I agree with, is that we need to really urge to return to a rules-based environment, so a rules-based system that is practiced not just by regional players, but internationally as well. Every nation needs to see that all states are all playing by the same rules of the game, which is not something that we are necessarily seeing today. Where Malaysia sits in the context of these changes, we are ripe, I think, to be able to respond proactively. In the 2025 year ahead, Malaysia will be the chair of ASEAN, and it's an opportunity for not just Malaysia to showcase where we are as a nation, but also to provide some leadership in the region and to provide leadership for the world as a whole in terms of responding to issues, in terms of setting the tone for these various challenges. What these various challenges are will evolve as time comes, but some of the things that we are also approaching, and I think the government has taken these as priorities, will be things along the lines of digitalization. Where does government versus business lie with regards to digital regulation, reform, artificial intelligence? These are things that are being grappled with. Second is on climate change. So on this front, I do think the ministry is quite forward-thinking and forward-looking. Not only do we have the National Energy Transition Roadmap, we also have the recently launched climate change policy. But I think for those things, we've said all the right things in terms of putting forward our vision and policy and the policy. But what people now really need to see is that these things are catalyzed much more quickly, and that they are downstream faster, meaning that the industry is also in the know of what kind of value that they can provide. They are waiting to see as well what are the actionable things that they can do, what are the actual programs, what are the actual projects. And then I think just a quick third area will be in the energy and of course also security aspects. So they're quite related, because in terms of energy, I mean, I just talked about climate change, but for Malaysia, how quickly can we transition away from being coal dependent into relying on gas, and then eventually going on to the renewables? And how we get the energy transition and the energy mix right for the next generation also impacts upon our ability to provide security. So food security is one thing. Food security, we learned all about what happened in the COVID years when the region reacted by imposing a lot more protectionist policies, for example. Can Malaysia also ensure that at the end of the day, Malaysians not just have sufficient food to eat, but also are priced at the right amount? And this relates to many other things that Malaysia needs to do in terms of thinking of the systems, how to balance subsidy with floating prices to urge innovation and efficiency to eventually achieve security.
And to be honest, looking back before pandemic COVID-19, we can see the focus of the governance, the public policy and the civilian, we can see a bit different. Maybe they more focused on modernizations. And during pandemic, we're a bit step back, as we can see during the maybe early years of the pandemic and the recovery process like 2020 until 2022, we are more focused globally, we are more focused on the recovery. How can the economy get back up, and how can we ensure the well-being of the people, and probably in 2022, 2024, from what we have learned from the 2020 to 2022, okay, we know this is what happened to our economy, our country, and maybe this is something that we learn, and from 2022, 2024, we can see a bit more focus on the technology, AI and green initiative probably are the things that can save us in the future as well. And in PM also mentioned his alignment with Professor Joseph Stiglitz's concept of progressive capitalism and government intervention. How do you see this approach influencing Malaysia's economic policy moving forward, and what are some of the challenges that you see in the future might arise?
So, in response to the first part of your question about things that we've learned in response to the pandemic, I think the pandemic, upon reflection, showed us a lot of institutional failures, actually, and it's not just Malaysia. I mean, it was common to many countries. The speed at which, for example, in the healthcare system, we were able to respond, but there were also a lot of gaps. In the hospitals, for example, in their inability to order the right equipment at the right speed and the right pace. You could also see the breakdown of the medical personnel. And these are some of the things that, of course, the Ministry of Health has now had to deal with post-mortem. So health is one. The other thing is the economy itself, right? So we also could see a lot of fragility, actually, in terms of people's incomes, very rapidly depleting. It gave us an insight into the tourism industry. It gave us an insight into SMEs, how they are very, very cash-strapped, and they are so reliant on the business that the moment things shut down, within a matter of a couple of months, we saw these numbers ballooning out of proportion, that many of the SMEs shut down. I think even in the tourism industry today, some of the hotels are still only now recovering from that period of time. So the resilience and the adaptability needs to be strengthened in order for there to, if there's any other pandemic that takes place or any other shock to the system, I think that's what this conference is all about. It's about our economy, or the pursuit of potatoes. The pursuit of potatoes, or the pursuit of something, of mechanisms that we can build into our economy and into society, to ensure that we will always constantly be adaptable, flexible, but also resilient to withstand any externalities or unpredictable moments and events. In response to your second part of the question about this, finding this fine balancing act between what people normally refer to as unfettered capitalism, the idea that corporations and the private sector, when left to their own devices, will not take actions that are actually beneficial to society as a whole. So they're not thinking so much about the public good, but they're thinking more about the private goods and the private services, balancing that against the role of the state and the role of government. So Professor Stiglitz's book, which was echoed by Prime Minister Anwar in his own terms of the humane economy with social justice, essentially what they're trying to say is that you know, and this was actually also reflected in the keynote address this morning, where he talked about the Industrial Revolution from Europe actually set the tone for everything else that followed. We today are living in a rapidly industrialized world because of what the Industrial Revolution was able to provide to us at the very beginning of time, at the beginning of the revolution itself. What we've seen, and this is what Stiglitz and Prime Minister Anwar are trying to say, is that there is a need for regulation. And that is true. It is important for the government to be able to provide that regulation to ensure that the players in the market know what their boundaries are. They know what they can and they cannot do. I think the problem is when, number one, if the state is not transparent about that regulation. Number two, if the regulation is unfairly imposed upon players differently, meaning that not all players receive the same treatment and the same regulation, or if they're not transparent about it. And also number three, if the government also takes their regulatory role into their hands so much so that they too overstep their boundaries and they become players in the markets. So not just becoming regulators and facilitating the possibility of the market to do what it would like, but also to become players in the market itself. So I think it's very fair and right to talk about the government playing the role in financial regulation, in environmental regulation. I mean, I completely agree with those things, but I think I would also like to point out the three possible pitfalls when these regulatory reforms are not done in the right way. And we do see many examples of that in Malaysia. And so in our pursuit of ensuring that we want to control the private sector from not posing harms onto society, we must also remember that they need to do that responsibly. They need to do that with the right balance themselves. And as I said, making sure that they're treating all the players equally. So sometimes that's not the case. Yeah.
And I like what you mentioned previously, that you said that maybe one of the agenda from this forum and all the initiative that has been made by the government is to strengthen the adaptability and resilience, especially for SMEs, tourism sector. All sectors were affected, but this is one of the biggest sector that was mostly affected the worst, and they are the backbone of the country, which most of the countries. And Malaysia's structural reforms, as you say, including, as you mentioned earlier, a subsidy rationalisation and floating price for essentials. From a political governance perspective, how do you think this reform will impact the trust and confidence of the public? As you mentioned, is one of the effect is probably the regulatory was not translate transparently, and maybe it was imposed in a wrong direction, and maybe too much from regulatory section that possibly taking all the markets. Probably we can share with us, probably, how do you think this reform, maybe it's seen for a longer term, it's for the benefit of the country, but for the short term, maybe they say, are we going to sacrifice our short term probably a well-being just for the sake of a long-term benefit of the country? What's your take on this?
So we've been talking about structural reforms, both in terms of institutions as well as in the economy, for a really long time. This predates this administration. These conversations have gone back to 10, 20 years in the past. The problem is that governments and politicians are very sensitive, hypersensitive, to any sort of change that would possibly impact the earning power or the savings power of citizens in the today, in the present day. So because there are a lot of short-term thinking, they need to also know about the long-term effects of that, which is why I'm actually quite glad to see that this has started. So this administration has started to put its money where its mouth is in terms of two things. One, the diesel subsidy rationalisation, and two, also allowing the floating prices of things like chicken and eggs.
Yes.
And if you see that it's done incrementally, and if the government comes up with a very strong narrative as to why this is important, I believe people will be able to accept that. There are other things that will be coming as well. I mean, there's potentially things like, I'm not saying this is going to happen, I know budget is taking place soon, things like the fuel subsidy rationalisation, RON 95. So that will impact most of us. We all use petrol, not so much diesel in our own cars. The other thing that is possibly going to happen, not now, maybe in the future, in the near future, or mid-term future, would be the restoration of the GST or some form of consumption tax that goes beyond the sales and service tax. So if these things take place, what's needed is to have a strong narrative and a communication plan. So that's definitely the case. You need the government to tell the story about why in the long term it's important to shore up these fiscal reserves of the country in order to invest into things of the future like healthcare. I mean, we talked about how healthcare systems are also in dire need of financial injections, to be honest. And secondly, things like education. I mean, we can have a long session about education and why the schools are actually in need as well, infrastructure-wise. Many of the more rural vicinities of Sabah, Sarawak, Kelantan, Terengganu, Perlis, Kedah, even actually some parts of the more urbanized sites of Selangor, Perak, Johor, are in need of this renewal when it comes to education and healthcare. And the other aspect is to also remember that if the government can not just speak, so I talked about a strong communication plan, but also act when it comes to other policies in the same breath of economic reform. So other policies like institutional reforms, putting political reforms in place that will ensure that there's no wastage, there's no, financial leakage, let's put it nicely, into certain selected pockets. In the past, I think the problem is Malaysia has been subject to a lot of crony capitalism. So that's why they fear these things happening when they see that the government collections are on the rise, and you see a repeat year after year where the Auditor General's report talks about wastage at the hands of certain civil servants within ministries. How does that make them feel about the responsibility and the ability of government to provide accountable bottom lines when it comes to the money that they are the stewards over? Ultimately, it's public money, right? Whatever monies are in government, it's our taxpayers' money. So being able to sell that story well and put together reforms that are more accountable. So some examples of this would be like the Government Procurement Act. So the Government Procurement Act is something the Ministry of Finance, I believe, is working on, and we hope to see that taking place soon, because procurement has always been a source of great leakage and corruption. I mean, we see that, right?
Yeah.
So put together these laws, put together these policies, and build the house right. Get the foundations right. On the economic part, yes, but also do it on the institutional front. And then the rakyat will be able to rebuild and restore their trust in government, which, to be honest, has been broken in the past, and it's very easily broken as well. And a final example I'll talk about, so I talked about the Government Procurement Act as an example. We already have the Public Finance and Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is great, but it can be improved. And finally, something that the former institution I used to work with, Ideas, championed for a long time is the Political Financing Act. So you put these legislations in place. There are many others, but I won't bore you. I mean, it's not enough time, I think, to talk about everything. But my point is putting these political reforms in place, simultaneous with the economic reforms, with a strong communication plan and a strong story to sell. That, to me, is the magic formula that the government needs to be able to put these things into place.
And I also wanted to take also from what you've said earlier, Malaysia's upcoming ASEAN chairman and the potential partnership with BRICS. How do you see Malaysia position itself in shifting geopolitical landscape first? And second, probably as emerging economies, it's very important and essential for us to learn from advanced economies, high-income nations, because probably they have more sources, they have more suitable policies that maybe we can learn and adapt. But it's not only that, but how can we learn and adapt and lead the conversation and take the lead in this?
Yes, so I'll start with the last thing about how we can take a look at international best practices and examples from developed nations. We need to be careful about everything, so not all policy prescriptions from developed nations can be adapted to our local environment. We need to look at the context of Malaysia. We need to see, other conditions the same, like when other countries introduced those policies, were they the same as what we have today? But having said that, we do not want to reject everything either, right? So we take the best and we contextualize it to what we can use and operationalize immediately. When it comes to ASEAN and BRICS, so we know that ASEAN has not been as effective as it could be having said that, ASEAN centrality is also very important, and it's crucial at this particular moment in time, as there is the US-China trade war, which has expanded beyond just a trade war. It's a geopolitical positioning war, and it's not just involving US-China now. It's of course involved other players in the fray as well. Russia is there. And seeing what's happening in the Middle East as well is deeply concerning, I think, to many Malaysians. So ASEAN can play a role. ASEAN can play a role in navigating between the powers that be, and to demonstrate to the world that it's not as simplistic as a West versus the rest story that I think we tend to see, or we tend to believe is the case. What we need to do to navigate between that is to talk about how relationships on the trade, on the foreign policy front are highly complex. These relationships sometimes even transcend geopolitics. If you look at the private sector, for example, they may be ambivalent when it comes to politics or geopolitics. They will continue to trade. They will continue to look for the supply chains that are the most efficient, that are the cheapest, that provide the best labor and factors of production, because they're thinking about ultimately how they're going to make their profits, right? So these relationships are complex, but to strongly argue that we want to, I think many nations in the world today are trying to navigate between these polarities.
Complexity and the dynamics of everything, correct.
I earlier talked about the importance of international rules-based policy, or returning or restoring the rules-based environment. I understand why our Prime Minister has applied for BRICS. In his speech yesterday, he talked about the global South-South. And this is precisely because we have seen too long, I think, the dominance of a primary geopolitical narrative. And it is really time for the smaller nations and the nations of the global South to speak about what their preferences are. So I see BRICS as more of a geopolitical and sort of making a political statement about this. It's probably less economic. I think till today we don't actually see what the positive effects would be for Malaysia to join BRICS, financially speaking. So, what are the benefits that we would get from the trade point of view? I don't think we've seen that yet. But from a point of view and a perspective of being able to put our arguments forward with a stronger collective with other BRICS nations, because now BRICS is not just about the original BRICS.
Correct.
Then I think there is great value there. So combination of the economic powerhouse of ASEAN being able to negotiate in terms of trade with the other blocs, and BRICS for a more global South geopolitical perspective. Perhaps the combination of these two things, especially in 2025 next year, will put Malaysia in a very strong position to be able to set the tone and leadership for the rest of the world. We're also aware, of course, of the US presidential elections taking place next month.
Yeah.
So the results of that, I think, will also dictate how 2025 looks like for us.
Great, and the year moving forward.
Yeah.
And also, you also mentioned a little bit of the national budget, this upcoming national budget that will be tabled in 18 October. And in Prime Minister Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim's speech, he also mentioned the need for balancing populist demands and even responsible governance. Doctor, how do you view this balance in this context of Malaysia's upcoming political challenges, particularly in ensuring that reforms are both effective and publicly accepted?
So the positive thing that the Madani administration has going for itself at this point is political stability. We know that elections don't need to be called for till 2027. At the latest, of course, there is speculation that perhaps it might be a little bit earlier, we're not sure. But the point is, we're only in 2024, so we have at least 2 to 3 years to go before the elections takes place. This is the time that the government can really set leadership, that tone right in making the changes necessary towards governance. So we talked a lot about already institutional reforms, economic reforms, structural reforms. Those are the things that can be done now. And, you know, I think, yeah, he talked about the sometimes challenging dual positions of populism versus doing the right thing and getting the governance right. That's, I understand it's really important to strike that balance. But really, Malaysia doesn't, Malaysia, I think, at this point, would be more favorable towards the governance approach, because that is something that players around the world are also pursuing. So better governance also leads to better economic outcomes. That's what the evidence shows, and the likes of, you know, many of the international institutions would also say that. So like I said, if you have a strong narrative that shows us that actually economic outcomes and governance go hand in hand, they're not actually diametrically opposed to each other, and demonstrating the effects of that to people will actually show people that this is what you want.
Correct.
This is what you actually want to see in order to improve your livelihoods at the end of the day. Because if you get the governance right, you're building your house right, the structures will be there to provide the right opportunities for all of us to increase our wages and increase our incomes ultimately. So I think that's where we want to go. That's where we want to see. So hopefully we won't come to a place where populism, which is essentially looking at only the short-term gains as opposed to the long-term effects and positive outcomes, will not distract our administration from doing the right thing. And I must say, it's not just about government, right? So it's about the ecosystem. It's about all of us supporting that as well. So it's about civil society, it's about academia, it's about think tanks, the media, you know, writers, the like in the economy, corporate sector, to be able to see that and to build a strong story that this is what's needed for all of us to prosper and prosper equally. The populist approach, I'll just give a last point before you get to the next question. The populist approach would be, for example, over-dependence on early EPF withdrawals, which is what the government had done previously. So because of COVID, because of the flood victims and so on, you know, many of our Malaysian citizens actually took early withdrawals of EPF, and that is an example of populism winning, because you're taking away your early savings as opposed to being contributing those savings to what you would eventually need in your retirement. So I'm not sure if EPF has been able to plug that gap. I mean, well, EPF itself can't, because it's actually people's own savings, right? It's their own personal savings for the future. So I think people need to continue to think about what that did to people's personal savings and their pockets, because we need to talk about the looming retirement crisis. So yes, while we're doing all these structural reforms, have we actually resolved what happened in, you know, under the previous administrations, which allowed these early withdrawals to take place? So the retirement crisis for those people, that remains unresolved, and that should not be repeated. Ideally, we should not go in that direction. Yeah. So if there's any other pandemic or any external shock that takes place that harms our economy, let's make sure that the governance approach, the long-term economic approach of getting the structure, the system right, eventually allowing our wages, our jobs, our incomes to rise, let's try to go there and not go to to the populist approach, because, yeah, like I said, that example is something that I think people will still be living the effects of in time to come.
And this is a very critical aspect that we should have a look on. And I know that we have to release you based on a tentative for this forum. You will have a session later. Maybe you can share with us briefly some teaser or context. What will you discuss at the stage later?
So my panel follows Professor Stiglitz's keynote address or main address from his book, I believe, and he will join the panel as well. And the panel will be on industrial policy. So we also have Dr. Nelson Barbosa, who is the former Minister of Finance from Brazil and currently heading the Central Bank of Brazil. So both gentlemen will probably be speaking about current industrial policy trends, very much along the lines, I think, of what we've discussed today, thinking about US, China, which are the countries that have a competitive edge in industrial policy. I will share Malaysia's perspective of this, but I will also add in some remarks about my area of research, which is on federalism and decentralization. I want to look at the role that subnational governments play or can play potentially in the future, like states or regions, not just in Malaysia, but around the world, what role they have in contributing to industrial policy. And I mean, some examples would be coming from, Malaysia. We've got Sarawak, Selangor, Johor, Penang. Like, these are the states that have very much attempted to do their own sort of industrial policy, even though technically speaking it's not under their mandate. So I'll be talking about that role that states play. Because ultimately, industry and the economy, the downstreaming of that will always happen at the state level, right? And second, I'll also talk about what happens when there's friction and tension between the central and the subnational levels of government, and how do we overcome that?
Again, I would say thank you very much, Dr. Trisha, for your insightful perspective on how Malaysia can navigate this complexity and what it means for the governance, and we can say the public policy and the nation's role in the future. As we look ahead, it's evident that we need to ensure that not only strong leadership, but also how can we engage and inform public policy. Definitely, again, I would say thank you very much for joining us, and I hope we can continue our important conversation like this in the future. Again, I would say thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And definitely all of our discussion here will be featured in astroawani.com and across all social media platforms. And that's it for me. I'm Nina Rozman. See you next time.